This is the second part, or session two of Earthly Possessions. I don't know how many we'll go. We'll just see how it teases out. We'll finish it off probably sometime in May. Um, we in our last session kind of went through a giant history of human civilization. So just as a real quick recap, John, you weren't here. You were
I've
here.
watched it.
Okay, you did watch it. Okay, so
Mhm.
you probably have it more fresh in your brain than all of us. But the whole point of the last session was really just to define a baseline of how things that are external to ourselves came into being, and with both with a sense of functionality, and then with a sense eventually of desire and want. And you see that cultivated. And the idea of having more or having stuff, I don't think has ever not been a human thing. There's just been less stuff to have. So, King David had a lot of wealth because he had stuff to have, uh, because people gave, and it was, and right or wrong in the time of the world, that's what it was. So as things began to develop and grow, and then in the seven in the you just we go from hunting and gathering, where the only thing you need are weapons to help you to hunt, and containers to help you gather. And then that's you're living, in fishing pole, you're living a pretty simple life. The need is based, and then you have movement of culture around that. Well, then when they found places where they could figure out that they could grow and cultivate, they established, and you see a domestication of human life, and you see the development of then homes. So before, it was temporary spaces where you set up and go, and it was just a shelter, temporary shelter. But think about that shift going even from the concept of having enough things to provide, sheepskins over or whatever, to provide you shelter, to the point where you could, develop fabrics and weave and provide fabrics that would protect you from the elements, to a place where you were actually, much like in the region that we're of the world we're in, like adobe type structures, and you go down a little south, and homes that were permanent, not pick, you couldn't pick them up and so the minute you establish homes, then you establish locations, you establish communities, and you start to see culture develop, and you start to see more complex social relationships develop, in the manner in which people then are operating with one another. And when you have cities, you still had, probably you still had agricultural, but at the end of this, we'll talk about the relationship between an individual and the production line. What went from, probably a trading of fish or trading of meat or trading of resources and berries, into agricultural development in a trading barter system, eventually became, several people in between, a middle person becoming the store, where people are bringing to, they're buying, are putting on credit grains and wares at the store, and then they're selling. So you have someone, so as we change the structure of even how we obtain items, from an era where you had to fashion them with your hands and make them for tools, to a point where now you buy them, and now, heck, we don't even, what do? We don't even make the effort to get out of our seat and go to a store. We can just, get on, you could be doing that while you're doing lots of other things. You can buy, hey, I just bought something. And you know what? And in a world where the sense of immediacy, we don't have that here. I think in Lake City, we're a little probably a step, in the better direction of needing to wait. But I've said this before. I remember in Louisville, it said if you ordered it by 10 in the morning, it would arrive at your door by 5.
Yeah, hot, ready to eat.
And it could have been food, but it wasn't. It was, because if it was in the warehouse and it was 30 minutes away from where I was, it was another way to move a product. Um, Whereas here, prime means nothing. But then when you see, then you see the development of, in the early 1700s, in the first industrial revolution, when you see the development of the loom, and the development of, what are the other, I don't remember all the other, coal and steam and electricity,
Industrial.
and all those things that form the basis of all of our industries sort of grow and develop, and then it basically gave us the capacity to produce more. And those productions were centered around urbanization areas or areas where they had these means of production. And so therefore that went out there usually by heart, horse and cart. And then the second industrial revolution around 1870, when the rail, which was an industrial revolution around rail and communication, where you get the rail, you get the turn of the century, you get the development of automobiles and flight. Uh, and so when you imagine for yourselves and imagine a country where you have these centers of industry, where you have things that are being developed, but the biggest struggle is how to get them out. And then when you solve the problem of how to get it out, and you created, and gradually over time and over centuries, you create an entire interconnected network with a rail system. But then once the automobile was invented, and then over the last century, as that's developed, the interconnectivity of that. Think about the fact that you used to get a trip ticket, get the roads, and you go through these things, and you're kind of tracking your progress on these little maps. To the point now, all we do is we just speak to our phone, navigate me here, and we not only get a path to that place, but we get that with consideration of the speed that we probably drive on a regular basis, the traffic that's there, and how do they know the traffic that's there? Because the satellites are pinging every other phone in that area.
And you have all the air carriers too.
And it's just this, and when you think about in a century, the dramatic change that's happened in industry, and so it went from production of the first industrialization to transportation, and to some extent communication, in the second industrial revolution, if you want to take that up to where, if you want to take that up to maybe and I have the 1940s as a smaller industrial revolution, when I think the development of the second wave of communications went from the phone and telegram to the phone, and then it went from radio and television. And that form of communication did something unique, is it made communication one way. Telegrams were typically back and forth. You're sending a message, you're communicating. Yes, that was a one-way sort of thing, but it was interpersonal. When you had the telephone, but you have usually two people on the end of the telephone. But you start to have sort of directive messaging, and you see that on the radio, you see the beginning of the television, and eventually you see that obviously surface in internet and those sort of things. But you see this shift in the 1940s of the way we communicate goes from largely communal. And we talked about that in previous times, the 1930s architecture being more communal in the front yards and front porches. But in the 1930s, 1940s, you have this development of communication that becomes one directional. And you have the beginning of what started to be the privatization of social environments by moving from the 1930s to the 1950s, where you start seeing patios being developed in the back of yards. And the shift of the social environment, you shifted to another part of the yard. They also developed rubber and plastics, and I think that this is where I think that we probably can identify one of the biggest growth points. Again, the reason we buy is not because we need it. The reason we buy is because there's a perceived idea of it, and we're getting into the marketing of it. But the product, if it's not there, there's nothing to buy. So the relationship that we have with our things, there is an entity on the other side of that is producing a thing that then produces a desire in us and then directs our desires toward that object so that we consume it. So the production of that, the amount of creativity and expansion of production over the last 100 years is unprecedented, with the introductions of synthetic rubber and plastics into our culture. Look just around for a second at the things that are plastic and that probably would be very difficult to have. I mean, even to your buttons, Well, buttons, what were they before plastic? Well, they were wood or metal, or bone, or some other. But even the production of that was not. This is a pressed button that comes out, and they come out in 1,000 in a press probably. We're surrounded in so many ways by by plastics, and I think that the development of plastics, coupled with all the other things, but it just gave an expansion of the way of the things you could fashion. There's only so much you can do with a hunk of metal. There's only so much you can do with a piece of wood. But there's an infinite amount of things that you, I mean, look at you with a 3D printer. Now you have in your hands the capacity to print almost any shape that you could possibly imagine in the material world. That level of advancement in terms of technology or evolution means that our relationship with things become complicated because there's more things to consume, there's more things to have interest, there's more things to grab our attention. And I think that that leads us to our present day age where we have all grown up in a culture where the consumption of products is the norm. And if you were to go back 200 years or even 150 years, go back to the time even in the late 1800s, so like a Laura and Ingle Mary, I always think we read those as a kid, so I always think of that day and age, how they did all those things. But just think about how they, again, functioned. If Pa needed something, it was him going to the store. And again, you got to reach the point in culture where the things were coming to the store and the relationship was with a store. But he went and he bought things that they needed. And I remember hearing, remember the stories where when sometimes they got to come and they got a few coins to go buy some sweets, and this was like huge luxury, like we get to have a treat. So the relationship they had with things in the sense of the amount that we consume now, the capacity, but part of that has to do with if the stuff wasn't there and if the industry and if the technology and if the manufacturing hadn't all come alongside that, there wouldn't be things to consume. Make sense?
Mm-hmm.
So that's why we have, so, I mean, and if you think about, and if you go, like I was going on an exercise myself, go back to the time of Christ and think what the average person needed. Food,
Clothing.
and clothing. And even Jesus says that, don't worry about the clothing on your back. Takes the most basic, essential item that we would name that a person might, and he says, don't worry about what you're going to eat or drink. Don't worry about what you wear in your back. And yet we go 500 years after that, in the time of, the early or the destruction of the Roman Empire, you had civilizations that were built then. You had definitely things, and there was definitely class. The higher class you are, the more wealth you had, the more things you had. But oftentimes that was inherited and generationally. Actually, if you boil down how much some of those nobility at those times had, it really wasn't that much. It was just way more than, and it was more valuable or more intricate. You jump up to 1,000. Still no printing press, still nothing, still a pretty, but you probably had things and belongings that you used that you needed to function. And you didn't get a new bowl unless the bowl you served everything in and broke. 1500s, you start to see the beginning of things. Now we can print books. And yes, it contained knowledge, but they are then things outside of ourselves that we store. You go 1700, you see the development of all sorts of things. The 1700s, this is the beginning of the Industrial Revolution, where you start to, and again, from then, I don't want to go through the whole history again, but then the next 300 years after that, you see us and where we're at today, and seeing things that we can't even comprehend. Think about the screws and all the little springs and things that are in a watch, just how majestic that is. We've been doing those for centuries. But when you think about our computers, there's just things that we can't even fathom, like what a microchip is, how it's produced, and it's the idea of the bigger and smaller manufacturing that came about in our world. Why are there trucks that have wheels that would fit into this room and that can build bridges? Hopefully we'll get some of those. And yet there are machines that are producing parts that are so small we can't even see them with the blind eye. The capacity has radically changed. Again, just to talk as you think in the last century, there's been a number of shifts, and you think about the societal shift. that goes from community to individualism. And again, I just love the whole, and I reference this a lot, but going from the front porches of the 1930s to the patios of the 1950s, to the privacy fences that went up in the 1970s. Think hot tub, no one wants to see that. To the 1990s, where in 80s and 90s, where you started to see decks appear. And I think the large part, I've said this before, the large part I think is because this is during that period from the 1950s on, you see massive globalization, you see shipping, international shipping trades, you see outsourcing manufacturing because of the fact that you have a shipping trade and you have in all of the development around the laws and this, and the idea behind the U.S. concept of that is that we can make it cheaper over there and we can provide it to our people with less cost. But then you get a few greedy capitalists in leadership, and then all of a sudden it's, well, we can make a lot of money off this. We can still provide them cheap stuff, and we can develop what ends up being a pretty unethical system globally, where we outsource jobs to, and yes, you can make the argument that we even in fair wages situations in other countries, we're still paying a fraction of the cost of what we would in this country. If you want to have a pair of shoes like like these Air Jordans that are made in somewhere in China or some other country, if you were to have the same level of attention put into something like that and have a person make a living wage from that, they'd be outrageous. I mean, Doc Martens. I'm a longtime fan of Doc Martens. Like the shoes, they got big, thick soles. That's what they have them made in England, and they're still made by hand there, but you pay $300 for them. But if you want a Malaysia-made Doc Marten, well, you can get them for about 100. But what you're talking about is someone's literal physical labor that they're putting into sewing and putting it together. So, and you're paying almost for that relationship. And then in 2010, we started putting fake decks in because we started putting laws around demolishing the rainforests in our own supplies of woods, and we're putting regulations around those. And when that ecology of that came in, you see a big shift. And I think that that's when we also were in the first eras dealing with the consequences of the plastic age. Because now we had plastic bottles. I mean, think about the fact of what we did before plastic bottles. At least you have a drink in there. Someone said the cost of a bottle of water, if we paid that for gas, it was I don't know, it was like $20 a gallon or something. It's huge. But the waste that we create for one-time experiences in our lives in the last 2 to 3 decades, when you see that shift. I mean, I'm 50, you go back to when I was just graduating high school-ish. I remember you had 2 liters.
We had glass bottles.
You had glass bottles.
You had to be very careful.
And you had to
with a
recycle
large
them.
Bottle of Coca-Cola. If you dropped it, it would blow up and send glass flying everywhere.
Yeah, I remember.
And it could wind up in your leg and your neck and your.
Yeah, and you
deposits on the bottles, and they refilled them.
And they refilled them.
Pressurized
Or recycled them.
No, they refilled them.
Yeah.
They washed them, and you could look at the bottom of the Coke. Where's it from? Fort Worth, New Orleans. They had the city that the bottle was.
I apologize for bringing this back.
No, that's okay. It's a great example.
I'm not.
But this goes back to, but then we're seeing the effects of that, and so you started seeing decking of that, and this goes back to the idea of us trying to be a zero waste, hiker center, because the very population we're dealing with, that matters to them, and we're seeing, and this is the pendulum swing.
The population we're dealing with is what?
It wants to see a zero waste environment. In the hiker center, they like the idea that they love the fact that we are reusing plates, because they constantly deal with the struggle themselves.
Well, they have.
Because they create waste that they don't want to create. But honestly, when they come, they have one grocery, like the old school grocery bags, tight, and it's all smashed in there. And I'm like, are you kidding me? Like that's like that's my afternoon.
Well, but that's also. That's a chosen.
Yes, it is.
Adventure for them,
and really,
and an experience, and they're on their own mission to accomplish something, and part of that mission just they can't carry. They're limited by what they can carry,
and the capacity of that they
like
carried, and
old days, before.
I think though, when you have reduced your belongings to that few things, and then you have things that you're going to dispose of, those things take, and you're also, you're walking all this time, you're not having all the other distractions. You're now seeing that waste and with a different
for sure,
lens.
for sure.
Because I know they all mourn this. Sorry, we're throwing out. I'm like, you know what? Well, that's what we expect. And obviously, it's more now. I think we're in a day in manufacturing. But again, going back to the whole notion, the idea of the plastics. If plastics weren't introduced, we wouldn't have these things in our lives.
Well, one of
in
the
the
other
same
things too, a lot of the things that are manufactured can be replaced by remanufacturing versus cost to repair, if it can be repaired at all.
Yeah.
So if it breaks, it's, back from the good old day, my dad and I'd go to the hardware store, test the tubes in the TV, go back, put tube in, you kept the TV. TV goes out now, and you go, what would it cost to replace this? How can I get it repaired? Nobody repairs them, so out
Yeah.
they go, and they recycle the parts or do whatever they do.
Put it in landfill.
Yeah, and then the other things, look at the demand though that advertising has taken and how advertising creates demand.
Yeah.
You may not want it something, but something comes up on the screen
Plants a
and
seed.
you go, oh my God, I want something like that. I gotta have that pair of shoes.
Yeah.
You've never seen it. You used to get it in catalogs, mail order, that sort of thing. And nowadays, heaven help you if you Google something that you're looking for something.
Oh, you do.
And then your phone and your computer, everything comes up every other ad.
You don't even have to Google it. They can hear you.
I think so.
Oh, absolutely, they can hear you. Can you all hear him on when he's talking? Glenda?
I'm trying to, yes, we can.
Okay, just want to make sure.
But
Well,
we
since
can't
you,
see them. We can't see them, but we can
yeah,
hear 'em.
I should. I was. That's why I just shifted my camera. So when they're talking, I'll spin it around. It'll be a little dizzying, but it'll be okay. Since you mentioned marketing, I did go through the brief history of looking at marketing and how that factors into it, and when that was a lovely segue. I'll give you five. I'll give you a $5 later for that. Really, when you think about advertising, that's a pretty new phenomenon in the history of civilization. Going back and the earliest thing that I could see that even someone wanted, that I was like, maybe, was 1450. And you're like, what on earth? Why would it go back? But when you start to think about it, well, 1444 they invented the printing press. So it probably wasn't long before someone's like, hey, I can do a lot of these little pamphlets pretty quick and put something out there. And when they're doing it quickly and they're printing like that, all of a sudden, if you have, again, material throughout the history of the world limits the capacity for consumption. But when they have the ink and they have the paper, you had your first brochure. And that led to the production of books and other things. But it was the first time someone could advertise for something in a way that was distributed. Otherwise, if you were a blacksmith, you may have a sign that says blacksmith above you or some indication that you're a blacksmith. People are coming to you, or you're traveling as a traveling tradesperson.
The beginning of the one-way communication.
Yes, it
In
is.
newspapers, that would mention, but that's, yeah.
And when you think about that philosophically, even the development of books, now all of a sudden you have in your possession, whether it was a book or a pamphlet or a piece of paper, something that has a message that has the capacity to influence you, that is not animate. And that likely was intended with some purpose to persuade, inform, educate.
Your choice of the word influence is interesting too, because now they have people that are called influencers.
Yeah, oh no, yeah.
And they're on every
Well,
TikTok.
they make
There.
a lot of them are actually making.
Sorry, I didn't realize that
Well,
wasn't
yeah,
on.
but that's what
There you go.
happens is people listen to that. And they follow
you go.
that very closely. And it's the same thing that you talk about buying clothes. They have people that read style, they have style. Here's the spring fashions. You want to have, this is the color.
So you hold on to that thought. You're jumping ahead, but that's good. You're thinking this is what But if you're embracing the idea of you're making connections, and that's good. So the first magazine doesn't come out until the 1730s. So now you have a conglomeration of. So just.
What was that?
I didn't write down the name of it, but
Fertilizer review.
in
Here's a robot.
In 1839, you had the prevalence of posters being put on private property because they note that because in France they banned posters on private property, which led to the development some 30-ish years later, 35 years later, of billboards in 1867. Um, and then from 1867, you have billboards, you have magazines, you have posters, you have pamphlets, and you really don't. And so it's usually visual and some sort of materially based. It doesn't really have a massive shift until you see the beginning of telecommunication or radio and telecommunications. In 1922, you have the beginning of the first radio advertisement. So now radio is not just for communication. Now it turns to what else can we use as, oh, a store can advertise something, or you can you share a product with someone or a service with someone. And again, now we're into the stage of one person sharing to unprecedented numbers, outside of literature, and then it requires the actual reception of someone taking that piece of paper. Now you have anyone with a new, and think about that, you're going from a visual type of learning, of input, reading the signs, seeing a picture. Now all of a sudden with radio, you're bringing in an entire new sense in terms of how you perceive. Now you have an audio one that will eventually and they'll eventually merge, obviously. Radio advertising, 1930. Television was developed in 1927. By 1930, you had advertising on television. By 1941, there was a distinct, a published correlation between TV ads and sales and purchasing. So around the time of the end of World War II, you had this understanding that if exposed to something in a general medium, even in a one-way type communication, that you can have impact on someone's psychology, although we wouldn't have been talking about perhaps back then as explicitly as we are now, and desire. And I mean, just think about the power that all of a sudden unleashes. The capacity to shape someone's ideals, their norms, their perceptions of themselves, of the world. And they probably weren't thinking that deeply psychologically about it at the time, but that's what was being opened up. The idea that explicitly pandering to something or directing something, we are constantly being driven towards purchasing something beyond the basic things that we need.
And done in many ways too, because when you take music that goes along with it, how many songs on commercials that you could hear two words and you go, oh, they're advertising this and that, and people would sing those things and they go, I can't get that thing out of my head today.
Yeah.
Kind of a thing. And so it became even more expansive or inclusive in all the things, all the medias, eyes, sound, music, all those, like I said, all those kinds of things. And people go, unbelievable.
And the influence that we give, I mean, and no one thought about this then. It just was it just happened very organically in that regard. So then you have 1950s, you have the first telemarketing. Now you see, and then at first that was a good thing. It was like, hey, we have products that are good that people could have. And in the 1950s was a time of revolution of innovation of domestic items, vacuum cleaners and there's lots of I mean, they're always doing better things, and the toaster ovens and I don't know exactly what toaster ovens, but that was around, the Starbucks book. That's when coffee makers went from the 1950s, went from being in shops and restaurants into homes. And I think you also get therefore a domestication of the event of, you see developing coffee culture, but the idea of, that's when, think about Folgers ads and what they're reflecting on, that idea of having that morning cup. And well, you go back to the 1930s, that wasn't necessarily a thing. You go back even earlier, there are cultures that didn't even have coffee. So even in the change of the rhythms, those have all been shaped largely by the production of goods and the capacity to communicate and market those goods. So we're in that final industrial revolution where we're talking about marketing. 1970, you see the first mobile advertising. You see database marketing. You see the beginning of spam. You see the beginning of e-commerce. And it wasn't widespread, but it was already being used, and it was starting the revolution of the way we do business, and we were starting to do it more electronically. 1985, newspaper ads actually reached a peak of $25 billion, and you would think, well, why would a paper print reach that all-time high? Well, when the introduction of word processing and desktop publishing with graphics, all of a sudden it opened up a new world to advertising in print form. I mean, think about this think about how many times you go to an ad, if you went back to newspapers or even just an organizational ad that has just little squares. Here's the information. Nowadays, you have all sorts of ads. You have pictures, you have color, and you have psychologists undergirding all of that, saying this is how you actually attract people's attention. And the silver, we haven't hit May. Oh, is today May 1st? Today's May 1st. All right, I'm sure he'll give me an extra day. Speaking of which, I was supposed to give our ad for the Silver World Thread thing today to Grant. It's fine. I'm sure I have an extra day in there. I'm almost done with it. But I look at it and I'm like, 3/4 of the ad is the picture of the church. And is that really the best use of the 6x inch ad is to have, a 4x4 inches of the church. You can walk by and see the church. People take the picture of it all the time. You want them to recognize it. But the question becomes in all of this, and this is what everything happens in every point of advertising, is if we want people to have recognition, we want people to recognize, we want people to come, then we as a church are using that as an advertisement. And so the question is, how do we do that, and what psychology plays into that? 95, you have this first search-based marketing. It was a web-driven marketing, so you all of a sudden you had because the internet was sort of it was called search-based marketing, where what you searched for probably regenerated ads on the side of things for you, and probably 1998, blogging became a source of marketing, and this is where you get what you were saying, the idea of an influencer. Think back to the internet prior to blogs and social media. Were there people telling you how to buy things? Not really.
Not like today.
Not like today.
I mean, maybe a billboard, you might see a famous person. Maybe in a commercial, you might have, a plug of an advertisement. But then you usually was just kind of like, did Mr. T's advocating, insurance really make me want to buy insurance? No, but I enjoyed seeing him on there. Who doesn't like Mr. T? But blogging became that first source of, now we had people who could say, here's a link to this, here's a link to this. And then now humans became conduits for consumerism. If you want to be like me, you'll purchase the same products. And if people started to esteem that blogger, whatever they were doing, I mean, you could see this over, people who blog and do sites on cooking and recipes. They have the recipes, they tell their story. They're not just saying, hey, here's a great recipe that's been tried and true, you should run off and do it. They're tweaking a few things, and they're putting a narrative around it, putting a story in it, and they're selling their personality as a conduit for someone else saying, I want the life that you have. I want to be like you. Therefore, I'm going to buy the products that you buy because I'm not like you, but if I buy products, I will be a little more like now. Does the person think about that psychologically?
But I don't think that's exclusively what influencers do.
No.
There is I mean there's a lot of people that I would channels and these influencer types that I'd put into the category of, they are selling, there's no doubt about it. They are being a conduit, but they're also educating and providing information.
Oh, absolutely.
About what's there. And you could easily get trapped into the, I want to be like them. I can see that. That's definitely a part of it. But there's also, I mean, I want to learn about things and how somebody does something and what tools they use and is that tool any good versus another one, or here's how you go about making or crafting something.
Yes, and I agree with you. And I'm not trying to say all influencers do this, because there are a lot of people who are saying, hey, I want this information out there. I want to share information with you, and I'm going to put some ads on my thing so that then I can actually take the time to do that.
I do not follow Kim Kardashian.
No, but like you have,
And
but
I'm sure I'm sure that she has a lot more followers than the people that I watch.
yeah. But even then,
but I'm not one of them.
but I don't even want to say there is celebrity influencers, but there's non-celebrity influencers.
Oh, yeah.
I mean, and I think they probably account for more of the commerce. I don't think anyone looks and says, "Oh, look, Matt Damon has the newest, Nike hat. Maybe I should go out and get one too." Because you're not seeing Matt Damon on a regular basis. You see him maybe in a video every now and then. You see him in a movie. But now, and just jumping ahead to our present day in the last 10 years, but with social media feeds, you are seeing Mr. Beast, or who does a bunch of goofy videos, or you dabble in, you hope to ask questions about the whole TikTok, Instagram, Snapchat world, and it opens up an entire world of absolute inane nonsense that is solely driven so that people will just continue to watch. Yeah, because it goes back to we should all, at the end of this, we should all watch the movie The Social Dilemma. And I'm sure most of you probably aren't participating in social media to the point that you actually are affected in the same way that my generation and younger are, but you become the product.
Oh, for sure. If it's for free, you're if there's no fee to use it, like Facebook.
And even if there is a fee, sometimes you're still the product.
You're still the product, absolutely.
And so, but it begets this whole notion of the relationship that we have with stuff, when we have now come to the place that not only in addition to our consumption of stuff and collection of stuff, that we are the stuff. And money's being made.
Well, think about in the advertising world, how many people they can reach with certain ads, depending on the viewers watching, let's say, a program. I think back to Super Bowl. A 1 minute ad in the Super Bowl was like $6 million, $7 million this last year. That's it. For some small companies, that's their whole year's worth of advertising budget. And they put it right there because they had a fixed audience that they were going to do that.
But in that level of advertising, it's like guaranteed, because the commercials have become an industry of their own. I don't even care about the game.
Yeah.
I'm gonna go grab my snack during the game. I want to come back and watch the commercial.
I do see the creative efforts.
Exactly.
Of these people.
And all
Yeah.
that kind of stuff, or some.
The Clydesdales.
But even back,
But the Bud Light thing didn't work.
but before it got creative, and it wasn't always creative, it used to just be commercials. It was an ad. It wasn't like super creative. It was just an ad. Back then it was expensive, and you think nowadays with even more in the capacity, the bang for your buck, if you put a commercial out there, it's going to get recorded, passed on, and so just so just for a second, let me give you about 6 more dates just to put you 2000, 24 year, a quarter of a century ago, we went to pay per click marketing became a thing. Which means that then people were creating things for the purposes of clicks, because that's how they made money. 2003, you have social media starts to come on the scene. You have MySpace, that's kind of a social media, but then you have Facebook that is established in 2004. And shortly after that, you have 2005 Google Analytics. And then I think that's the first time you see that shift where humans now become the product. And we're not an embodied product. We're just sort of a digital entity that collects tags that then tells other advertisers which things to send to us. 2008, you see development of online videos with YouTube become, and other video viewing sites become more the norm. 2010, smartphones are considered to have saturated the market. And now we don't just have to go to the computer or go sit down at a TV. but we're carrying our phones around with us, and we're literally carrying the very device that's advertising to us almost all the time. If we stop and we think about, and again, a generational difference, but in my generation and younger, the amount of times that you spend on social media, that is so much of that is purely advertising. You're waiting, you're flipping through your friend's stuff and you're waiting for an ad, and you may not even think, oh, it affects me, but in the psychology of your brain, you're still inputting that in. And it's just when you think about the influence that we give marketing agencies and companies by virtue of smart devices and social and free social media networking.
That word cookies.
Absolutely.
Nowadays, here's our cookie policy. I accept basic, just necessary. I want the whole package and all the privacy. All you're doing is giving away a lot of what you do.
Well, hang on. The cookie thing is,
It's actually necessary.
it's necessary for to
To
a
an
browser, when
It is
browser-
No, we're not even going to do a debate about cookies.
no, hang on. The cookie thing came into being because of the way a web browser works. It's stateless. It does not
Stateless,
maintain.
right.
It was
Does not
meant
ha-
to improve our experience by
No.
allowing us to more seamlessly go through, wasn't it?
It was, a browser does not have a continuous connection to the server.
It used to be
the source.
No, yeah,
Fake.
yeah.
And what the cookie does, it's a little piece of data that enables the browser to do more stuff, like e-commerce and banking and things.
And
Now,
know where
the
you were the last time,
advertisers
'cause
in
every
that
web page
world
is
has corrupted
Yeah.
it and leveraged it. But you can turn on options in your browser that throw them all away every
Sure.
time you close
Yeah.
the browser.
But a lot of
And-
people
do
don't-
that.
Most people, I
We're,
look
we're
at-
rabbit trailing.
Most
Okay.
people will not understand that and they don't do it because they don't know what they're doing.
Yes, you're right, and that's the problem and that's the problem with marketing. Most people, they're not thinking about how they're being marketed to. They're just and teenagers are the way. All that's to say is that leads us up to 2019, where they recognize that AI algorithms have turned us into are at a place where they're reading and curtailing our online experiences to the point where we more, and this goes back into the dopamine book, the idea that we're constantly looking for little hits of dopamine. That's what they're doing. They're trying to hit you with little bits of excitement of dopamine. And what it's doing is sort of this numbing of oneself. And this book that I just taught over at the course I was teaching at, called The Anxious Generation, is talking about this current generation that's being raised in a world that they have been overprotected from in the real life. And even smartphones have allowed that overprotection to happen. Where are you? I can locate you. I can always reach you. You're always, you always have you'll always call an emergency, but a feeling of overprotection and fear of the world in the real life, but a lack of protection in the online world where much of their time has been spent. And so when you think about the exposure of what a teenager has in our world to stuff on the internet, stuff that is unprecedented that they have exposure to, and they're in their developmental brains can't adjudicate the vastness of the virtual world where they spend a good chunk of their time, and adjudicate with the fearfulness of the real world that has been propagated by a culture that is fraught with pandemics and political strife and school shootings, and exposure to global trauma and global turmoil in a way that no one, and we have adult brains and can see that, can turn it off, but just the exposure that they have, and their curious brains tend to seek those things out. So all of that's to say is the marketing has led, to a place where we're in a bit of a crisis in our world. And the question now becomes, why then do we purchase? And in order to do that, we're going to turn to the psychology of the last century, of shifting what has happened in the same time we went through this marketing timeline, what has happened psychologically in the developments of how we understand the human brain and what that does in creation, alongside social media and exposure to technology. So before we do that, any thoughts or questions anyone wants to throw out there?
So somewhere in this journey we're on, and probably not today, we're going to
Turn to scripture.
well, we're gonna turn to scripture, yeah, but we're gonna try to develop an understanding of where it's where and maybe how. Maybe we know a little bit about how, but at what point it becomes bad and becomes a negative, and
Yeah. Well,
and I would submit that a lot of the strife that we think the world is in is maybe because of this excess stuff.
yes. Well, I mean, it kind of goes to the idea that we all, if I were to say, does anyone here think they can buy happiness? No.
Well, there are a lot of people that do.
No, and yes,
I don't know that they outwardly do it. I think psychology makes some think buying will be happiness, but they're not buying it because they think it's going to make you happy. They've been conditioned.
Yeah.
it is, and it's the law of well, there was another, I don't remember the exact name, but it's the idea of the law of diminishing return.
Yeah.
And diminishing return, that at some point you continue to buy a bigger boat, bigger boat, bigger boat, bigger boat, bigger house, bigger house. Not, sorry. As I sang that, I realized you were into boating. That was,
No. Actually, I've gotten rid of. I'm going those smaller boats, little boats.
whatever it might be.
This isn't confession time.
I've downsized.
Big, bigger house, bigger wardrobe,
Yeah.
better car. And every single, and you get that hit when you get it,
Right.
and then it fades, and you want that hit again, and again, then you get into the economy of our world and the capacity of expend. Like when you look back at the percentage, and this is why and I'm probably going way more into this than you all want me to, but for me, it's fascinating for me because I start digging around the systems and I start thinking about even in terms of the economy of our culture, the whole notion of quantitative easing. In the fact that we have seen so much of that and we don't talk about it in our culture over the last century, the devaluation of the dollar, we have so much more expendable income in our culture today, despite the fact that you go back 50 years ago and a teacher on a high school salary could get into a home, but now they can't. And so you start looking at all of these things and the capacity and the way financial trends have influenced not only our purchasing power, but how we and what we have the capacity to purchase. It goes, and you see you see a stretching of classism. You have a higher elite and you have a lower middle. And then you have the whole strata of society that most of us in Western white culture don't want to talk about, and that is that the true poverty line and where that begins and how that looks and throughout our and the level of homelessness and lack of basic. I mean, this is when you think about how many churches do after school programs or backpack programs because there are children who go to school without, and you take all of that and you think what a sick generation we are as a whole, where we have so much excess and so much poverty, and yes, how do you fix it? Then you get into the political side of it. Is it social welfare? Is it education? Is it community? It's all of these things combined, and you can look at it from a variety of different perspectives. So you tease it out in a lot of different ways, but at the end of the day, what I want us to understand is, without stuff, there would be no consumption. So part of the problem is the capacity that we have to manufacture stuff. The second part of the problem that I want to point to is the fact that we have become beings that are marketed to and respond to that marketing all the time. Think about when you go into the grocery store. And maybe I don't really do that as much anymore now because I do it on my phone. But the ads, you pick up the ad. What can I get? Is anything that I normally buy on here on sale? If not, is there anything that I don't normally buy, but just seeing it, I didn't know Kit Kats were 2 for $1.
Yeah.
I don't need a Kit Kat, but I'm going to certainly get a whole box of them now.
Yeah.
And when you live in the mountains, you're like,
And you get a dopamine rush for getting that.
oh yeah,
I got this great deal.
exactly. You know what? When Ben and Jerry's or Haagen-Dazs is at $3 a pint, I'm like, oh, sweet Jesus. And you get a dopamine rush, and and because we live down here, and if you want to go here and get a pint of ice cream, it's going to cost you an arm and a portion.
Bad part about getting it there, though, is my mail before you get home.
There you go. Anyway, all that's to say is you can't take the marketing outside, the marketing aspect, and just and this is a societal thing. It's not an individual thing at this point. It really is a societal push. And when you couple that with just capitalism as a whole, again, and we can't escape the fact that capitalism brought capitalism in particular, both in an economic but also in a digital era, took the ceiling off of things. You can only at one point you can only have so much money in the world because you had to have the gold to back it. Again, quantitative easing has changed that, but now we have Bitcoin, and there's no cap on what that thing is worth or what not it's worth. But what we went from a time of even when you have the production of things, there was still a limit in the first industrial revolution. When you had the production of things, you were still limited by transportation. While you increase the transportation capacity, now you're not limited by transportation. You can produce more, you can transport it more, and more people have stuff. But in the end, you still have stuff that you have to deal with, and there was a supply and demand, and that was a basic part of economics, supply and demand. But when you move from a barter and trading to a supply and demand to a pure capitalist technological information era, where zeros can be added to an infinite end, we now create a category where there is no cap, there is no end, there's never enough. And this harkens back to the idea that we've talked about this many times throughout in many of the classes that are things that I've talked about, the idea of the golden mean, that when things are off kilter, if you're the golden mean, MEAN, the medium of something, that too much of something is not healthy for the human species. Too little of something is not healthy for the two human species. There's always a balance in the center, and the theory is, in terms of happiness, is finding that sense of balance between those two ends. The golden mean is what it's called. Is where we find a sense of deeper satisfaction. I think the third piece of that we need to be aware of is what happened in our understanding and the development of psychology, because I think that not just in terms of advertising and the understanding of psychology absolutely played into the development of marketing. I think they went hand in hand. The more we understood about the human brain and our impulse control, our capacity for desire, all of those things were tinkered with over in the previous century. We start to see those the interplay, but it also, not just in terms of marketing and consumption, it also came into terms of how we view ourselves in relationship to others. And when you talk about competitiveness or comparison, again, without the stuff, there'd be, keeping up with the Joneses, there was nothing to compare to. There was a point in history where it was only the feudal lords who lived in the Downton Abbey, and the rest of the village who kind of lived in the same standard of living. And someone may have a little bit more than you, but in general, it was a kind of a common, Now it's kind of like, well, with the production of stuff, now you have a capacity to determine who has more, who has the newest, because there's stuff, again, without that stuff. But the idea that we then compare ourselves has come, and the hedonistic seeking out of one's own pleasures are 100% tied to the movement that we not only talked about in terms of architecture, but in terms of the way we relate to one another, moving from a communal understanding of how we exist in society to a very individualistic place. Everything was done in community. That's why the Lions Club and Rotary Club and all those things, civil groups developed and had a strong place in society. I mentioned Robert Putnam's Bowling Alone. Is that anyone? I don't know if I don't know what I taught in Austin with the Austin students last week. I don't know. I've talked about a lot of this stuff recently, and I've been thinking about a lot of this stuff in terms of all of their connections. But there was a book, I think it was in the early 2000s, maybe late 90s, called by an author by the name of Robert Putnam, and it's called Bowling Alone, and it was the death of civil communal groups in society. So the Masons will always be here, but no one cares about the Lions Club. No one cares about the Rotary Club. No one cares about the Women's Club. Like in even in the Boomer generation, you see a breakdown of that. And so the idea was there were bowling leagues at one point, and everyone came out and they came to the bowling alley and they gathered together to do something embodied, but that now people will. Or with a small, just they go out with just their friends and go and bowl. And the irony of that, I remember when I was reading that, I guess it would have been, I guess if I was reading that, it was probably early, no, maybe it was later, a little early, later in 2000s. I don't know when it came, maybe early 2000s, but I remember taking a group of kids to the bowling alley and they were all on their phones, texting each other across the little bowling table. And I was just thinking, this is true. Like we've lost any sense of just putting your phone down.
It's like you come to the dinner table, kids are, everybody's told, put your phones in the basket over there and turn them off.
Yeah.
And then they're like, but at one of the judges' conference, they had a professor from Ohio University was there. Forget what class he was teaching, econ or something. Had a young lady in there, and class was an hour and a half, and he told them, no phones. You'll bring a phone, I'm like, you're gonna be listening to me. He got a phone call, mom wanted to come and talk to him, and was talking to him about her daughter is now in counseling because she can't live for an hour and a half without knowing what's going on in the world socially.
Yeah.
You can't tell everybody what she had for breakfast and all that kind of stuff. And she's literally, and he's serious, it's a heart attack. He goes, she's serious. She's thinking about suing me and my standard that I'm taking away a lifeline that she needs. And it probably will, I don't know whether it ever got litigated or not, but think about that.
Well, if I
Well,
look
that's
at-
the bottom line, I'm sorry, the bottom line though is it's a me world.
Yes.
It's all about me. I mean, me and those kids especially. Really, that's the saddest part, I think, is that's where we're lacking with the community because they're so,
It's back
me.
to entitlements things.
Oh,
Yeah,
definitely.
well,
violence.
the phone thing, social media, that device, what it can deliver to you is super addicting. And it's super, that dopamine thing that he talked about. I'll never forget, we climbed Uncompahgre and my sister had one of her, I think it was her younger one in tow. We get to the top and he's on his phone up there. And she nearly grabbed that phone and threw it over the face.
Was he taking pictures or was he like checking
He
his
was
email?
streaming, checking his email, Facebooking,
Isn't that
TikToking.
sad when you're on top of
something.
Uncompahgre?
Was he sharing the view?
No, I don't know what he was
Well,
doing.
maybe
but
that
my
was what he
sister
was
got
doing.
so mad at him. It's like,
But even and just sort of bring this back to the conversation what we're talking about in terms of psychology, even the need to pull your phone out, even if it's to record and to capture, is somewhere rooted in the brain of I'm going to share this someday.
right.
And in sharing this, it raises my sense of ego, of self.
Right.
And this goes back to, again, what's happened over the last century psychologically has set the condition for this in ways that we didn't bring this upon us. As part of it's an understanding of the human mind. It was interesting to me to know that prior to 1879, there was no psychology. We didn't talk about it. A guy named William Wundt did the first experimental lab for psychology. He's accredited as sort of establishing psychology as a discipline. The first U.S. lab was in Johns Hopkins University in 1883. So again, you're only talking about 140 years ago.
Really?
G. Stanley Hall set up the first U.S. Psychological lab in Johns Hopkins University. In 1886 was the first PhD awarded or first doctorate awarded in psychology. 1892, the American Psychological Association was established by G. Stanley Hall, and also the journals a few years later that go with it. And so at the turn of the century, it was just the beginning of the understanding that we are more than like when you look at someone just as a human subject, that there's something going on in here and the question becomes, how do we understand what's going on in here?
So prior to that time when the first study of psychology started happening, certainly you had people that weren't mentally well, and you had human interactions still,
Yeah.
but no
You had
no formal study of it.
you had the loony bin or the psychiatric ward, or you had, where they committed people.
But this is just something I never thought about.
But in
That there
terms
wouldn't
of,
have been any kind of, I fully understand that we're in a progression of psychology, and all these things we're talking about have contributed to it and influenced it, right?
Yeah.
But I just never thought about when did that start, and then
Well, that's
what did they
exactly
do
what we're looking at.
before, and
Well, they didn't.
They didn't.
I mean, anthropology was a huge subject around the turn of the century. I mean, even the idea that anthropology, meaning the study of human groups or humanity, Margaret Mead went off and studied the Samoas, and observing a culture, it was like this breakthrough idea that, oh, the life that I live is not just about, because when everyone around you, I mean, and although there was urbanization, there was in large part, you lived in a pretty monolithic culture wherever you were at.
You're reinforcing each other.
And you didn't really, I mean, didn't have a vision that you may have heard of Africans or you may have heard of Asians, but you didn't encounter them in your everyday life. And even to the point where it's kind of like nowadays, we don't even think about that. We have such exposure to all nationalities that to meet someone from another race or, another ethnicity is not really a shock. Even if it was like this, 7 foot, unless it was like a 7 foot, jet black African, and you're just like, wow, that might throw you for a loop. But in general, you encounter someone, it's not going to throw you off. But there was a time in history where you could have been an adult, and in your, you could have been an older adult, and for the first time you encountered someone who was black. And just that, so globalization has just as much to do with the entire notion of what's happened. But the idea that we have went from studying cultures as a whole to then saying not just culture as a subject, but the human as a subject, and then the individual human as a subject, and then postmodernity comes into play in around the 1950s, and we start thinking about how individuals are developed in their own cultural context, and then over the last century, but in particular over the last 50 years, as you see the intermingling of cultures and the complexity and the network that creates, and the intermingling of biracial human beings, all of this is just getting more and more and more and more complex, and it makes the individual personhood that much more of a profound topic of study, because every individual brings their entire context to the table in a way that, you go back 100 years ago, if you're marrying someone from the same community that has been raised, you're probably marrying, you only had so much to choose from. So it's true. I mean,
No.
and even when you think about, if you dabble that into the world of aesthetics, I mean, how we view, you could say, oh, well, aesthetics are aesthetics. No, I mean, you go back to different times. I mean, not to objectify women, but the body shape that women have been sort of elevated as the ideal. Go back to the bodacious times of centuries ago, to the wafy thin of the 90s. I think we're having some more realistic perceptions of that. I mean, this is the whole notion of the movie Barbie, an idealized form of the female figure. Well, that's changed throughout history. No one looks like Barbie in the Philippines, and yet men still find their women, the women. And so it's all cultural. I mean, my point in this is all culturally bound. Even aesthetics, the way we view beauty, is culturally bound.
At one point in human evolution, women that looked like Barbie didn't survive and couldn't
Carry the
weren't robust enough to be able to.
Yeah.
I mean.
But my point is that this, even aesthetics around what we view as beautiful, what we view as good, what we view as what we view as favorable. And we're in that day and age now where that is constantly being redefined, which again, the technology that allows and it plays into our psychology of self-fulfillment. So going real quickly back to, just looking at the time, I'm going to fly through some of this and just point out a few points I want you to realize. And at the beginning, 1886, you had something called functionalism that came about, and that was the idea that our behaviors and functions of the mind are seen in our everyday lives. And that's how we started to say, well, if we act in certain ways, what is behind that action? So then you start talking about will, you start talking about desire, you start talking about need, you start talking about, and you see through all the last century also the development of the study of the brain as we get to a point where you actually can study the brain and actually have scans of it and electrodes that stimulate it, and they can study how it operates. To the point that we're measuring dopamine in bodies when they in someone's body when they're having stimulus sort of, and we can understand that. You probably have in one of the biggest shifts in terms of what I would say the motivation to buy comes in Freud. 1896, he developed the first psychoanalysis, the field of psychoanalysis, and he believed that people were motivated by unconscious drives and conflicts, the avoidance of pain and pleasure, but on an unconscious level. But I think their understanding that we have drives that underlie our unconscious means that ties into the marketing idea. You say, well, I'm not being marketed to this. Well, your unconscious is being marketed to that. And you're receiving that message in ways that you don't understand. But Freud, for the first time in the history of human civilization, points to the idea that there is something unconscious. Now, he teases that out into some dark, weird things, but what he uncovers is critical to understanding our unconscious desires to buy.
One of the lessons I remember was when they said, if you watch a commercial and you don't understand it, it wasn't meant for you.
Yeah.
And that happens more and more.
Unless it really was meant for you.
In your subconscious level.
In your
No,
subconscious
the
level.
id is.
Well, yeah, and you get, well, that's when you start to get into some of that. But Freud started interpreting dreams. We won't get into, but it was based on free association, the way our minds can make the dots, and when you're not bound by structures derived for sexuality and other unconscious desires that mirror that sense of really lust for something outside of oneself. 1905. First IQ tests were developed, and then they started talking about mental age versus physical age. But this was the beginning of a stratification of a culture based on intellect. And also what ended up being education in class that ended up teasing itself out over the next century. And as they started studying, then you could classify people into groups of intelligence tests of saying we can study these people, we can study these people, and now you start to understand the effects because you have a way to categorize or baseline people. And now when you introduce things, you can actually understand how it affects the different under levels of cognition. Behavioralism becomes a huge thing, which is sort of in contrast to psychoanalysis, trying to find the other what's undercover, what's driving our actions in some unconscious way. Behavioralism tries to uncover what our needs are and how we perceive the world and how we interact in that. You start to have in 1970 they start to have IQ tests implemented for screening for Army. And then eventually the business sector followed, and then the education sector followed. So you have a further stratification of our society. And again, this leads to when you have a stratification of society, when it's the feudal lords up here and everyone else is down here, you don't have a comparative culture. When you have stratified people by their intellect, and then you start to feed in very European German sort of way people into trade industries, people into business industries, people into, and you start to, and then what happens over the next 50 years probably is the specialization of education for individual fields. What you're doing is you are creating a class structure that comparisons will always exist. You're reinforcing where one is at in a class structure.
Well, and then you overlay that with economic wealth stuff.
Absolutely.
Ability to acquire and have stuff, and you overlay that with power to take away from people so that you can compare themselves.
Yep. And then you have in the 1920s and 30s Jean Piaget. You have Stanley Hall, who talks about adolescence. We talked about the past, but Jean Piaget comes out. He's a psychologist who starts to understand that cognition and patterns of modeling and behavior and all these things that we're talking about now actually begin in childhood. Now jump ahead a century later, and the amount of advertising that children are exposed to is, again, these are all of these things are tied in together. In 1938, you have B.F. Skinner, who talks about operant conditioning of behavior, that we can actually, and that we're actually somewhat more animalistic, and that we can actually, through repetitious patterns, create behavioral pathways that lead us to behave in certain ways. And those comparative behaviors, the pleasure seeking, again, that sort of idea that you're constantly looking and you wanting that reassurance, and that leads to just briefly 1946, the National Mental Health Act. So since the 1940s, we've been struggling with what it means to have a stable society. First antidepressants were introduced in 1951, and this is the first artificial way we're using to escape the realities of life. And this is also when you start to see a breakdown in resilience.
Yeah.
Is something we talk about today. We're into 70 years of a breakdown of resilience. It's when we started using chemical means, to basically help us adjust to life. And yes, I'm not denying that there are some people who need antidepressants, and there are cases of depression that are really, and I think there are lots of things that factor into that. But the concept that prior to the 1950s, there was no treating of moods. Now, maybe they needed to be in some cases.
There was alcohol.
There was alcohol, there was marijuana, there were probably people eating mushrooms and licking toads, there were lots of other things. But I like the licking toads part. But all that's to say, 1964, they in conjunction with understanding that there was a bipolarity in humans, also came out with treating people with lithium. By 1973, homosexuality was removed from the psychological and or dictionary as being a condition, a mental illness. In 1974, they also developed PET scans that allowed us to measure brain activity. In 1976, Richard Dawkins, who was an evolutionary psychologist, came out with a book called The Selfish Gene, and it uncovered for the first time patterns of social dynamics that were based in sexual aggressive behavior, just aggression as a whole. And it was taking the idea that we are humans and have these aggressions to the idea that some of those things actually go on to a genetic level. And so we see in other words, we continue to hone in on who the person is on a genetic level and how they're have predisposition to certain things. The Insanity in Defense Reform Act was passed in '84, which says something about our culture as a whole, that now mental illness has reached a place where, and these are just sort of this is a movement of psychology, that you can claim to be insane. In 1987, they did a Homeless Assistance Act recognizing that homelessness was a mental illness. And by 1995, we identified the beginning of an epidemic of anxiety that coincides with the development and release and proliferation of the smartphone.
What year was that?
95 to 2000 is where the biggest.
Smartphones. That seems early.
I'm not the one dating these things, so.
Okay.
I think it's the beginning of where, I don't know what rates they have, but that actually in iGen, which talks about Gen Z, they do say smartphones became mainstream in 95 because it's where she begins Gen Z. So again, you and IT may view it differently,
It wasn't smart.
but I can show you where I found it if you want to read about it more. 2000, and by 2000 there was this notion, an understanding of the sequencing of the human genome, which the idea that we are such individuals that there's a sequencing that we're involved, that all of a sudden that every individual person in and of themselves is in a place where they need to have some sense of fulfillment. And in a day and age where we're losing the communal connection and we've isolated ourselves into both seeing ourselves as individual, but isolating ourselves through technology and changing the manner in which we communicate, all coupled with the idea that there is then marketing There are people inventing products that we need to make money, and there's the middleman of the marketing saying we're going to take this stuff and we're going to market it, and then we have the technology that allows us as individuals, and because we see ourselves as individuals, and I think this probably affects your generation you're the very first generation to have it affect, and you're also the generation that has the most money to be affected by it. And so you get caught up in this period of consumption, and what we see is the production. It goes back to the idea of pictures. You know, you go back to the 1970s, you had a roll of film, and then they had cartridges to make it easier, and you could drop off a cartridge rather than actually having a 35 millimeter film. And then the idea that you could, and every print costed you $1 or something, I don't know what it was. And then you get to the point where they're starting to give doubles, and then they get to the point where they're starting to, and then you're carrying around, now you're putting pictures in an album, and you have a sleeve of doubles. And we get to the point where now, and then he moves to the point where you have now digital photography, and you can take thousands of more pictures and print them. And people were printing those at first, and there was a whole printing industry around printing digital pictures. And then there's again the ebb and flow. You get to the point where no one's printing anything, but we have thousands of pictures on our phone of things that we don't even really. And we use photographs in a way that even don't even add to trying to remember something, or trying to remember something we're entirely missing because we're mitigating our lives through a screen.
Or to see something you can't read anymore because it's so small, and you can blow it up on the phone.
Exactly.
I'll take a picture of the label.
We took a picture of what we thought was an eagle outside John's house today, and it turns out it was not an eagle.
But all this leads to the place that we find ourselves in today, where between the production, the marketing, our psychology that is bent towards the fulfillment and of our own desires, and in a culture that understands psychologically that we feed on the rapidity of dopamine rushes, we find ourselves in a place that we're constantly consuming. So,
Is it a turkey vulture?
I don't know what it
Looks
is.
like
I'm
maybe
sorry.
a-
I'm sorry. My bad.
Falls in and
I'm
out.
the little child.
No,
in
that's
me had to
okay.
get his phone out.
well, we're about out of time anyway. So ultimately, what that points to is next week we're going to turn to the idea of we are in a place where if we look at this whole structure of how we've come, in other words, it's understandable. I think that my point in all of that is I don't think that we are this horrid, sinful generation. I mean, I think we are. We're always a sinful generation, but I don't think that we are a horrid, sinful generation that has just all of a sudden said we're going to do things differently. We're going to consume a bunch of stuff. I think that if we understand and we look at the history of the development of stuff, we look at the history of advertising, we have the history of our own sense of self in relationship to the world and our psychology and our desires and our desire to have a fulfillment. And then you couple that with capacity of technology to feed us that, and you shorten the timing that we want everything instant, we want everything right away. And we're going from small dopamine rush or hit to hit. And the idea that someone said that happiness is a emotion in the moment. Joy is a far deeper seated experience of well-being. There's a wellspring. It's a fullness, and people define these terms in different ways. But at the end of the day. And again, I think for those of us who have come here, and if you are part of Lake City, you probably aren't affected by that as much, I think, to some extent, because I think that there is a balance that comes with the love of beauty of nature. There's a balance of the sense of coming to a cabin that's, or a home that you don't have everything that you have. I mean, unless you're here year round, obviously, then it's your home. But there's a sense of retiring to a simpler life. It's not. Simpler does not necessarily not mean busy, but when you think about the nature of how we grocery shop, it's simpler. We go once every, So we're making choices. So it may not apply, but what we're going to do next week is we're going to take the idea that we have amassed and say, what does our now, as we've established, our relationship with stuff has come about through these means. We all know we probably have more things than we need, and we need to go through them. There's no denying that. The question is what perspective should we have through Scripture to understand the stuff that we have? And it will hopefully change the manner in which we see our stuff. It's not going to change the amount of stuff we have, but maybe it might put a distance in saying, hey, this is stuff. I understand how I got to the place where I have the stuff, but now the question is what should my relationship be with that stuff? So, and that'll be next week. All right.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Yes, thank you.
Hopefully that's interesting stuff.
It's interesting stuff. So